fact that for the first time since World War II in the history of mankind could destroy themselves.
We are at war with America, but it was always portrayed as they're the enemies.
There was this specter that nuclear war could break out at any time and everything that you worked for was for nothing.
People were so afraid to be prosecuted.
It was palpably something that you worried about and were afraid of.
When assessing the memories and perceptions of people in the Soviet Union and the US in the 1970s and 80s, it becomes apparent that both Americans and Soviets possessed distorted views of each other, though neither side admitted their biases. American pop culture reveals American tendencies to sensationalize and exaggerate the Soviets, while Soviet propaganda and censorship policies revealed the extent to which people in the USSR were unaware of world events. Though each side felt it was informed and believed in its own superiority, a retrospective look at the people, events, and attitudes of the two sides reveals the discrepancies between perception and reality.
The 1970s and 80s were characterized by constant shifts in American-Soviet relations and Cold War tensions. Going into the 70s, tensions were easing under the policy of détente, which sought to reduce animosity between the two nations after the tense years of the 60s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The new policy aimed to bring the USSR into the global political arena by providing economic incentive for participation. Many Americans did not like détente, especially when the US started trading with the USSR. However, despite the pushback from the public, détente ensured a period of relaxation in Cold War tensions lasting through the mid-70s.
Movies in the 1970s and 1980s allowed directors to portray their perspective of the Cold War in their own artistic ways to audiences all over America. As a result, the public's perception of the USSR was shaped by the influence of the media. Star Wars: A New Hope, written and directed by George Lucas, was released in 1977 and was one of the biggest movies and cultural phenomena of its time, as it had a significant impact on modern pop culture. Lucas critiques the dangers of human interaction, both in political and economic spheres of power in this film, and indirectly confronts the moral and immoral ways in which technology and nuclear power were used.
When you think about the Cold War and you think about Star Wars, there are some direct comparisons. For instance, the Death Star is nuclear war. I mean, they created a weapon that they could destroy an entire planet or an entire civilization all in one shot. And then you had this farm boy who came out of nowhere, who had these mystical powers he didn't even know about, who could rise up against this giant entity and end up winning and end up saving everybody's future. And so, that episode ultimately was renamed A New Hope, and it was really pretty profound for the time, honestly, that there could be goodness in people that could rise up against something as ominous as nuclear war and still prevail.
Ian Fleming's Bond films also explored the course of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear destruction during the 70s and 80s by creating a British hero who frequently saved the world from Russian evil. Bond films like The Spy Who Loved Me and Octopussy incorporate current popular Cold War sentiments. In The Spy Who Loved Me, James Bond works with a Russian spy as détente sentiments remain.
Détente indeed.
However, in Octopussy, which was released in 1983, James Bond goes against the villain Kamal Khan, who is part of a military scheme with a Russian officer to eliminate détente. This obvious depiction of the Russians as the enemy was understood by the public and led to a lot of American discontent and distrust with the USSR.
Though détente lasted through the mid-70s with limitations on arms as a result of the SALT I Treaty and economic ties between the two nations, Cold War tensions rose again with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and Reagan's election in 1980. Wanting to change the mood in America after the disastrous Vietnam War, Reagan targeted the Soviet Union and communism, referring to the USSR as an evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant...
He increased military spending and developed the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. Though it was never accomplished, the SDI was a missile defense system that was supposed to use satellites to create a shield. The increased military spending intensified the arms race and was accompanied by economic sanctions against the Soviet Union, all of which increased tensions.
The music created during the Cold War era was largely a response to the counterculture and rebellion of the 1960s. Artists like Billy Joel wanted to capture the American sentiment that the fire of dissent was not a new concept, and like other artists, including the Beatles, who wrote back in the USSR, connected his music directly to the conflict with the Soviet Union.
In the 1970s, progressive rock bands like Rush, Pink Floyd became extremely popular, and these were concept albums that told stories.
And all that you love, and all that you hate, all you destroy.
So the 70s were really coming off a very dark, down time, and the music really reflected that.
During the 70s and 80s, bands like Rush and The Who made music that effectively characterized the fear and hopelessness felt by Americans after the Vietnam War debacle and the brewing Cold War tensions.
The 80s were completely different. The 80s were more like, who cares? It was more about partying and superficial beauty and really kind of a lot of people would consider a time where the music was really empty.
We had sort of censored by government music, and that was ABBA and Boney M. Bee Gees. So those were, music that you can listen to without reprimand, right? But of course, one of the reasons for example, to listen to Voice of America is that because they had a weekly rock show, that was very interesting, and you could hear many more artists and learn about different culture in that way.
At the 1972 Munich Summer Olympics, tension ran high after a controversial call in the final seconds of the game gave the USSR their first ever gold medal in basketball. Renato Williams-Jones, a Soviet sympathizer, added time back on the clock, giving the Soviets a chance to take the lead. To this day, the United States has not accepted their silver medal. 8 years later, the United States and the USSR were opponents once again, this time on the hockey rink.
No one was expecting the United States team to do very well in the Olympics.
In the semi-final game, the U.S. team was clearly the underdogs versus the Soviet Big Red Machine.
They did win. At the end of the game was very exciting. Remember the announcer, Al Michaels, his famous countdown. This was quite a victory and quite an upset, and it was a great victory in a time that people were rather low.
Irina and Jill both lived in the USSR in the 1970s, but the two women had sharply different experiences due to their distinct backgrounds. Jill traveled to Russia as a 10-year-old with her father, a Soviet historian, whereas Irina grew up in the USSR. The contrast between their own awarenesses combined with Soviet historian Mike Hand's explanation of the events today reveals that the perceptions of each side were often biased and inaccurate. In the end, the everyday lives of people in both places went on, and no one knew anything beyond their own experiences, cementing the distorted perceptions and manipulated images of the government.
And events that were embarrassing to the Soviet Union, for example, its invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, were either by and large suppressed or spun to the point that they really did not conform to any kind of actual sense of what really happened.
I did not know about some that I should have known. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I actually did not know about that until about 10 years later.
Though people in the USSR were not aware of military and political advancements in the Cold War, that lack of awareness did not inhibit curiosity about American culture.
A lot of sort of young adult Russians were interested in were aspects of American culture like jeans and gum and any really sort of thing like that we kind of take for granted as Americans that were very difficult objects or things to get in the Soviet Union. We always had gum that we bought at the embassy, and we would make these exchanges for these really neat pins for packs of gum. And so we did have these very brief interactions like that.
Besides sporadic interactions with people from outside the Soviet Union, the main source of information about U.S. culture came from U.S. propaganda.
America actually had their own propaganda to Russia. So there was a secret station that you can find on the radio, and it's called Voice of America. So you could hear to Americans telling stories to Russians.
One motive for Soviet interest in U.S. culture was the fact that Soviet culture was either diverted into military and political advancement or suppressed by government restrictions.
The resources of the state went into the development and procurement of heavy industrial products and military weaponry, so that the Soviet consumer was left without many consumer goods. So
I think there were a lot of things that, a lot of the products and a lot of the sort of American images and those kind of things were really compelling and interesting to people because they were so different and they were American.
Instead of supporting interest in American culture, the Soviet government focused on using its media to portray the animosity between the two nations.
I think the approach that our government took is that you have to educate everybody on the enemy, and America was clearly portrayed as an enemy.
Soviet citizens were basically allowed to see and hear what the government allowed them to see and hear.
Nevertheless, as time went on, people started to recognize the discrepancies between government information and the reality.
It did occur to me that it's a little strange that people ask you to vote, but there's only one candidate. So at that point, I think I started to think that something is wrong with the situation. But we really never had any opponents, right? So there was only one person.
When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began relaxing for the last time. The Soviet policies of glasnost and perestroika opened up the USSR to greater outside influences. Eastern Bloc nations began successfully overthrowing communist governments, and the USSR began dissolving. The Berlin Wall was torn down in 1989, clearly marking the end of an era, and the Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991.
I'm Peter Jennings in New York. Just a short while ago, astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore. The wall that the East Germans put up in 1961 to keep its people in will now be breached by anybody who wants to leave.
With perestroika and the final easing of Cold War tensions came recognition that information about the other side had been distorted. Beyond that, as more information has since become available, people have started to recognize that the Soviets also had distorted information about the U.S. Such information has revolutionized the modern view of the Cold War, shifting some focus away from the military and political emphases and instead analyzing how the Cold War was a product of society, perceptions, and deception.
Even though tensions were easing, people in the U.S. remained wary of the USSR and communism, representing the deep-seated nature of U.S. prejudice.
I heard my dad say that I think there were times when I think people in the town sort of knew who he was and were sometimes a little suspicious of him.
As prejudice gradually eased, more equal and understanding views emerged. In particular, in Russia, the feeling of liberation predominated.
Kind of proves that it wasn't about America or Russia. It was really just about how ridiculous and superficial and stupid the whole concept was of world domination.
Complete sort of sense of liberation came when I first visited Germany, and shortly after there was a fall of a wall. So that was an event that was I could never forget. You know?
Soviet historian Mike Hamm emphasizes the extent to which societal and political deception inhibited progress for the U.S. and the USSR, demonstrating recognition of how distorted politics became in the Cold War.
And there's a kind of standing joke, who won the Cold War? Well, the answer, Japan, because Japan, which did not have an army after World War II, was able to